Good evening, everyone. We are continuing with our wonderful book in Divine Friendship, and we're almost at the end. We're in the section now called World Conditions. So let's pray together, have just a moment of silence, and then we'll start. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help me to feel your living presence. Help us to know that you are always watching and always with us. Help us to open our hearts that we may receive your omnipresent love, and to be calm and courageous, that when we feel your inner whisper, hear your inner voice, we can act on your inspiration and move ever closer, ever more quickly to your infinite love. Om, peace. Amen. Let's meditate for just a moment. Om, peace. Amen. So, my friends, last week the letter that we dealt with was what Swami wrote on September 13th of 2001 in response to the September 11, 2001 attack on the World Trade Center in New York. As it happens, we're coming up on the 20th anniversary of this, and I just saw a magazine article and people reliving and talking about all the lives that were cut off and all the implications of that. There's just there's no easy way around these things. Very, very difficult things happen in life. So Swami wrote the letter. The essence of it was sometimes you have to stand up to evil. You can't just wish it away with kind words. And if you don't have the power to transform an evil person's heart with love, then you need to face into the fact of evil and be appropriate in your response. I'm summarizing what was the whole class. So now, Swami responds to a devotee who objected to his comments on the terrorist attacks. This is September 23rd. This is 10 days later. Dear friend, there are a few points in your letter that show misunderstanding. I favor containment, not punishment. Of course, that's a very important difference, isn't it? Swami says if you, how did he say it? He said something to the effect that if you don't stand up to evil, evil just keeps marching onward. And at a certain point, you have to put out sufficient energy to stop it. I also mentioned the fact that Master said even, in a higher age where we have, for the most part, world brotherhood, he said there will still be bullies, and there will still be the need for a world police force to keep the bullies in line. So Swami says, I favor containment, not punishment. Containment means you prevent them from taking further evil steps. You don't wreak vengeance on them because they've hurt you and now you're going to hate them and hurt them back. But you do have to stop. You have to stop their evil actions. This world, as Sri Yukteswar pointed out to Master, is inconveniently arranged for the literal practice of ahimsa. which is to say the literal practice would be that you never thwart anyone else's impulse. You just let them do whatever they want to do. He said this world is not constituted that way because there's too much shadow. And if you stand for the light has to stand against the shadow. I think my image of cutting a swath of trees to save a whole forest is a good one. I've no desire to cause suffering to the terrorists, only a hope that we can keep them from causing much more suffering to other innocent people. Swami was saying, sometimes some damage has to be done, and when there is a big fire, sometimes a bulldozer will come in and the bulldozer will just take down a wide swath of perfectly healthy trees in order to take away the fuel so that the fire will be stopped at a certain point. Or they have another technique. I know this from decades ago when Ananda village was severely burned. They started a fire that would burn uphill because the fire had crested over the hill and was coming down, and they started a fire burning up. And it was controlled because the firefighters knew what they were doing. But when the backfire that they had lit met the oncoming fire, there was no fuel. And it was just as simple as that. There was nothing left to burn, so the fire went out because there was nothing for it to feed on. So you cut down a swath of trees and you've killed all those innocent trees, but you've prevented a greater evil because you've stopped the fire. So it's just an image that sometimes some damage has to be done in order to contain worse damage. So those who would perpetrate evil actions on innocent people have to be contained. And that may be perceived as, not a loving gesture, but it simply has to be done to prevent a worse evil from happening. Values in this world cannot be defined absolutely. This universe is under the sway of relativity. Sometimes a lesser wrong must be accepted in order to defend against a much greater wrong. And this is one of the fundamental principles of Ananda that Master impressed upon Swami was you have to be practical in your idealism. People often use the Second World War as a very good example because the evil deeds perpetrated on innocent people by that regime, primarily the Jews, but also many others, and just the nature of that regime, and it was sweeping through Europe, and it was on its way to take over the world, and so we had to go to war. The country had to go to war. Now nothing is clean, and there's always other sides to things, but that evil dictator could not be allowed. And so many innocent people had to sacrifice their lives in war. Many young men, many horrible things had to be done because allowing that evil free reign was worse. And so many times in life, there really is no pure choice. Like Swami says, values in this world are not absolute, they're relative. There's two bad choices, but one of them isn't as bad as the other one. And it's tough. Nobody likes that, but we can't manufacture a reality that doesn't exist just because we want it to. At least collectively. Individuals can make their own choices, but that's something else. Even Gandhi, who was not always realistic in this regard, urged that India be kept as one nation instead of divided, even if the result meant many interreligious deaths, which happened in any case. Gandhi, who wasn't, as Swami said, wasn't always practical, but he preferred the country to be kept together rather than separating the people who disliked each other, and it just turned out to a mess no matter how you took it. But Gandhi succeeded in creating a free India, but he did not succeed in creating an undivided India, and he did not succeed in stopping the religious nightmare, the sectarian nightmare that has continued ever since. This is just the world we live in. We can protest against it all we want, but it doesn't seem to matter. God is in charge, and this is the age we live in. America doesn't deserve the criticism it often receives of wanting hegemony. I'm not quite sure how to say that word. It is the only country in history that has helped the enemies who first attacked it. Talking about both Germany and Japan. I don't know what America plans, but certainly they don't want to kill innocent civilians. You know, whatever response America's going to take to this attack, they're not going to go and seek out innocent people and murder them. That's how Swami feels. For individual devotees, the matter is different. Okay, this is where it's different. When you're talking about national situations, international, global, it's hard to strike clear values. But you look for the best. And Swami was a great defender of America. I'm not sure how many other letters are in here. He did not at all approve of the idea that merely because America had failed to live up to its ideals on multiple occasions, that therefore it was a country without ideals. He felt that that was just this sort of crazy, impractical thinking that people are prone to. For individual devotees, the matter is different. I had to bear great injustice from SRF and took it as my karma instead of attacking them. Only after 40 years of persecution and SRF's attempt to destroy me and Ananda by lawsuits have I accepted that I've had to speak out. But I've no wish to harm them, only to prevent them from destroying Ananda. So Swami's saying when somebody behaves badly against you, there's no principle that says that you have to stand up for your rights and fight against them. If that's the appropriate response for you for various karmic reasons, you may have to do it. But when Swami was severely ill-treated, he just thought, there's no point. What is the point? But, as he specifically says, starting in 1990, SRF attempted through lawsuits to basically, well, just what he said, put Ananda out of business, is how the judge put it. And Swamiji actually said, if it had only been him, if the only person impacted by that action had been him personally and he alone, he still wouldn't have defended himself. But by that point, hundreds of people had, thrown their lot in with Ananda and made our lives Ananda. And Swami didn't feel it was right for him to stand back and let all those people who had trusted him be hurt. So on that basis, he then stood up. And he did. And then he fought hard. He fought really hard. Because he says, if you're going to do it, you have to do it. And they matched his energy, but in the end, the laws of the United States were against religious monopoly. And so Ananda prevailed. Your view of these things will undergo change as life brings you to greater maturity. I guess this was written by a young person or a person of inexperience. Meanwhile, keep in mind that the scriptures themselves teach what I have said, to act not with the desire to harm anyone, but to prevent harm to many people. Not to act because of fear, however, would be karmically wrong. Of course, no one wants war. Even war, however, is preferable to not standing up for what is right. And that is also a very important principle. A lot of times, and this came out a lot during the litigation years, devotees don't like conflict. And so we will do anything often to avoid conflict because we prefer harmony. But there's a certain point where to avoid conflict becomes the act of a coward. And you just have to be unafraid of the conflict. I mean, a coward in the sense that you fear the conflict. You might not want the conflict, you might not like the conflict, but to not accept it when it's necessary because one is afraid of conflict. That's why I said you have to act appropriately for your own karma. As Swami says, not to take yourself into account is presumptuous. Meaning, oh, well, I want to be harmonious, but my desire to be harmonious is actually my fear of conflict. I have to take myself into account. It's not appropriate sometimes for me to acquiesce, because I'm not acquiescing out of courageous transcendence. If I'm acquiescing out of fear of conflict, then that's not a victory, that's a defeat. So it's the art as well as the science. Okay, now we're going to go to a different letter, which was also, this was September 12th. So this was the day after 2001. An Italian priest expressed sympathy and concern after the terrorist attacks. Swami was in Italy at the time that this happened. I mentioned last week that he actually telephoned us from Italy, and we were in California, and he told us to turn on the television because there were big events in America that we didn't even know about. And there were a lot of Americans, especially at that time, in our community in Italy. So one of the local priests, who was a friend, expressed commiseration because such a hard thing had happened to our country. So Swami writes back to the priest, "Thank you very much for your concern. From Ananda, there doesn't seem to be any news as yet," meaning from Ananda, America. "I know of no one who has been touched personally by this tragedy," because we had a very small presence, if any, in New York City, and this was a very localized event in New York and Washington, and we were mostly on the West Coast. "The whole world is, and has been for some time, in a state of war between the forces of light and of darkness." Now this is 2001. The world is and has been for some time in a state of war between the forces of light and darkness. That's a pretty strong statement. "The war is not between one religion and another, or between one political system and another, but between the aspect of human consciousness which tends upward toward God, and the other which tends downward away from Him and toward material fulfillment and all that is born of matter consciousness, hatred, greed, intolerance, and the desire to destroy, as opposed to the life-giving desire to build and create." Now think about this for a moment. Think about music, think about musical performances, think about movies, think about television shows. Like, what is the central reality that we see going on? On one hand, there is a very large, speaking of America, but really through the whole world, there's a very strong New Age movement, expansive movement toward meditation, toward simpler living, toward living in harmony with nature, just many good forces. Simultaneously, and I'll point to the entertainment industry, if you just look at what kind of images, personalities, values are being constantly put forward in movies, television, insofar as print media, on the internet, it's just like the darkening forces are stunning. Now, I'm a little out of things, partly because of my age, partly because I dropped out of popular culture 50 years ago. And I'm not stupid, and I've lived in Palo Alto. I haven't lived in an isolated area for 30 years. So it's not like I don't know what's going on, but I don't seek it out. I was talking in some context or another about sexuality and, the lack of moral standards, and I was talking about movies and so on like that. And then someone said to me, you don't even know about internet pornography, which of course I don't know about it because it's just not something that ever interests me. But the person was telling me, young boys and girls nowadays are introduced to the most extraordinarily well, the word vile is what comes to mind. The most animalistic concepts of a relationship between the genders or with the same genders is not even any of that. It's just sexuality completely devoid of commitment, affection, love, kindness, support, anything. And it's anybody who knows how or is a scientist been interested. I mean, things that were unimaginable before are now common. Everybody has those pictures in their minds, or so I've been told, or can if they want them. Someone was also commenting to me about, he used the phrase, which just was perfectly ordinary phrase, first-person shooter video games. I thought, first-person shooter? I mean, that means you're behind the gun, and all you see is, I mean, there's a video game, but oh my God, what an image. I read in some article about the armed forces, is very interesting statistics. First World War, First World War, Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, up until the Middle East, the Iraq wars. And the weird, interesting statistics. How many soldiers never fired their weapons? Because they just didn't. They didn't want to. And they found a way not to. And how completely different it is now. And many people say it's because of those wonderful first-person shooter video games, where people just get to shoot all the time. And then you just talk about the movies. Like what, it's just like, and it's all so normal that we've become completely anesthetized to this. I mentioned before when a young friend of mine, college-age person, made just some remark about something. And my comment was, you have no idea how just morally bankrupt what you just said is. And this person has very high values. It's just that we've all been anesthetized to a gross level of reality that we don't even think of it as strange. And people with an absurd amount of wealth just spending it in the most selfish ways. And once again, we don't even think about it. This is what Swami says. For a long time, the downward pulling forces of greed and materialism and self-indulgence and selfishness and take what I can get, why shouldn't I? Have been at war with man's higher nature, with the forces of light and kindness and compassion and self-control and generosity. And fortunately, there's a lot of light in this world, but there is a war going on. And there's a lot of power on the side of darkness. So much so, as I say, that people don't even know it. They just don't even know it. You go, I don't know whether it's true now because I haven't been out that much lately, but I remember the period of time when all the women models, basically they looked like drug addicts. You just see these big expensive brands and you see these gaunt females with dark rings under theirs. I mean, really, if you didn't know what it was, you would think it would be like, some anti-drug ad, like if you're not careful, you'll end up like this. But it's exactly with the opposite. It's like, wow, spend a lot of money on these clothes and you can look just like these gaunt, strung out, bleary-eyed people. Look at it, think about it. It's even just, I rarely missed an airplane in my life, but in 2015 when I was trying to get from India to Israel, just as it happened, I made a very stupid connection. I missed my plane. It was all my fault. Then I managed to get another flight for the next day. I was in Rome. I was trying to get to Jerusalem. I made a flight for the next day, a very expensive flight. I didn't want to have to wait another day. And I got to the airport, and I usually just sit down by the gate. I like to be early and I like to be relaxed. I'm sitting by the gate, but right in front of me is this like 4 by 6 foot video screen that is flashing ads. And it's just shifting every few seconds, and I just couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand to be watching it and having it affect me. Even I didn't know how to do it, so I turned my back. And I had some work to do, and I was doing some work, but I had my watch, blah, blah. Well, the ridiculous part of it is I just was working. I was at the gate. I'm looking at my watch. I turned around. At the time I thought I could get on the plane, and they were closing the gate. And it turned out, and I was just like, what do you mean they're closing the gate? I'm sitting right here. How could I have missed a plane? I'm sitting right here. I'm looking at my watch. I couldn't even speak to anyone there because the gate was closed. I go over to the information counter. I said, what is this? I was right there. And I point to my watch. The man looks at my watch. My watch battery was running out, and instead of stopping, it slowed down exactly long enough for me to miss the plane. Unbelievable. At which point, when I saw that, I just said, God's will. I'm just, for some reason, I checked back into the hotel for another night, and I lost several $1,000s. It was insane what happened to me. But it was all because of that video screen. And everybody else is just sitting there letting these images just flash in their minds. How can we think? How can we have any peace? And they're just doing it because they don't want us to have any peace. They want us to be agitated and angry. Because the forces of, and I'm not talking about the great global conspiracy. I'm just talking about the forces of shadow and light that are always playing themselves out. And we get to choose which side we're going to be on. And fortunately, we can join either side. It's not like we have a government drafting us, at least not yet. So, he says, between that aspect of, I'm rereading this, that aspect of human consciousness which tends upward toward God, and that other which tends downward, away from God, and toward material fulfillment, and all that is born of matter consciousness, hatred, greed, intolerance, and the desire to destroy, as opposed to the life-giving desire to serve, build, and create. One more thing about that. I don't even know if this is still going on, but I remember the time when so-called musicians who had instruments, who were playing whatever was the popular music, they would smash their guitars. They would blow up their own instruments. And people would just watch it and think it was so exciting. Everybody would cheer. These people are taking the very thing that they're trying to create with, and they're destroying it right in front of us. Think about it. We've become so anesthetized we don't even realize how morally bankrupt those kinds of actions are. So we really have to choose. There is a war going on, and it's happening on the astral plane, and it's coming down into the material plane. And whether it will turn into a shooting war or a bomb war, I don't know. We shall see. America, obviously, Swami writes, is at fault for its material greed, which it must learn to refine, and fortunately is refining gradually by its own innate spirit of generosity. Morally and spiritually, however, the whole world is in a state of great confusion. Above all, what the world needs is love. So there you have it. America leads the world in materialism and greed. Swami thought it was interesting that the World Trade Towers in New York City were what were hit. It was it's a financial center. And the Pentagon was injured, but the symbols of democracy, like the White House, were spared. He just commented how interesting that was. Let us pray that we ourselves be given the grace to be instruments for the divine light, that it may flood ever more strongly and clearly into the world. And because the obvious question is, what do I do about this? Well, let us pray that I can be an instrument of the light, because light is very powerful, and light needs instruments, and we're always having a choice. A tragedy like the one that just happened will likely inflame anger, which will be to some extent righteous, but which also, unfortunately, will be unrighteous in its demand that suffering be inflicted on the perpetrators. So Swami's not naive. He knows what happens. They must realistically be prevented from inflicting further harm, but their very suffering in punishment could inflame nations beyond all bounds of reason and charity. So, these are not optimistic analyses, but we started this whole section with Master talking about what he sees, and Swami what he sees. So yes, it can start out as containment, and then we'll turn to revenge. We have countless examples in wartime, how men and women who see great injury inflicted on those they love, they lose their tempers, and then they inflict punishment on others, and so it goes. So it's a very complicated question. It is time for placing human problems more determinedly in God's hands. And this is what Master said. The whole purpose of all these difficulties is to awaken people to the need for God in their lives. And that's why those of us who are determinedly living as best we can, according to the guidance of God within us, are the solution. And whether we're politically active or write letters to editors or go out and march or anything like that, the reason all of this is happening is to unite us in an understanding of our shared divinity. So the more deeply we are working for that, the more deeply we are going to war and fighting on the side of righteousness. The Swami says, I wish there was less talk of the righteousness of democracy, which God knows has its faults too, and more talk of a determined dedication and submission to God's will and God's love. I'm sorry, my throat's full. Swami was saying, you have to understand when Swami talks about God's will, he's not talking about, we're doing God's will. He's not talking about that kind of God's will which strengthens the ego by giving us even a more exalted reason for just being ourselves. He's talking about what we mean by true discipleship, true self-realization, and so on. I'm not going to go into it at great length because I talk about it all the time. But you have to understand that's what he's saying. Submission to God's will means to understanding that we are part of a greater reality. So what's happening now is that everybody carves up their little piece. I'll just get what I want, and my actions don't affect anyone else, and as long as I'm satisfied, why do I care? And just like the spirit of generosity, of self-sacrifice, of duty, of self-control, of acting as if I am part of a greater reality, and therefore what I do matters, because vibrationally and by the ripple effect of my actions, we're all interrelated. The fundamental principle is not God, but we are all part of a shared greater reality. And we all have the same innate divine nature. And we all long for the same realities. This is God's will for us: compassion, kindness, brotherhood, and sisterhood. That's what the masters are trying to give us. And we're not learning it. And so we may have to suffer more. That's simply what Master has said. Hard times, Swami says. I can't help thinking that much, much more suffering lies ahead before humanity will learn its needed lessons. Thank you for writing in Divine Friendship. Now, it's not that Swami wants this to happen. Now, you have to bear in mind, there are certain principles that are essential to understand all of this, and I often reference the yugas, where we are all planets go through cycles, and we have chosen to incarnate in a very tumultuous period on planet Earth. And on my YouTube channel, if you type in yugas, R-U-G-A-S, or planetary evolution, and there's a wonderful book called The Yugas that you can order from Crystal Clarity. I highly encourage you, if you don't already really understand the principles of the yugas, it changes your entire perspective on what's happening. The Earth, it's interesting, it's like planets get closer and then farther away from the center of energy in the galaxy in which they operate. And Earth is moving closer to the center, and therefore consciousness is rising. But we've just come out of a comparatively low period, a period of low consciousness, and there's just an enormous conflict going on. There's a war going on. Now, bear in mind, the planetary situation is just the backdrop. It's not the real plot. The plot is the individual jiva, the individual spark of divinity that exists as an individual, and, me and you. And we are on a very long journey through many incarnations, from delusion to enlightenment. And when Swami asked Master, do we always incarnate on the same planet? Master laughed. He said, there's countless planets that we can incarnate on. The question, is there other intelligent life in the universe? Master said, of course. And he said the creation is teeming with conscious beings, sentient beings. And some of those planets are far more advanced than ours, and some of them are less advanced, because everybody's going through these yuga cycles. But when we're in the astral world, between our material incarnations, we can incarnate on any of these planets. Master said, no, you incarnate on many different planets. He actually said, if you only incarnated on the same one, you would learn too fast, is how he put it. Which seems like kind of a cruel thing to say, but nonetheless, that's what he said. So we incarnate on whatever planet has the right circumstances for us to learn whatever it is we still have to learn about where happiness comes from, what causes suffering, what's lastingly real, who am I? It's just all the cosmic questions that the jiva needs to understand as it moves from delusion to enlightenment. And so we can choose, we can incarnate anywhere. The astral world is completely separate. Let me phrase it differently. The limitations of the material plane don't exist on the astral level. And therefore, we can go to any planet at all. It's not like some of them are too far away or something like that. That's an illusion of the material world. So we, in our superconscious wisdom, and presumably helped by our angels and the masters, we incarnate in a place that will give us the opportunities to learn what we don't know about our own divinity. And tumultuous times in which fearful things happen to us are often tremendous opportunities to grow. Because fear is the opposite of love. And perfect love casts out all fear. And God is perfect love. Well, someone asked Swamiji, how can you tell if you have karma around something? He says, anything you're afraid of, you have karma there. But I think, well, I'm afraid of being tortured. I'm afraid of being imprisoned. I'm afraid of having my heart broken. Yeah. A master is not afraid of any of that. Think of Jesus Christ. He's not afraid. He wasn't afraid of anything. Enlightenment is not a small story. So how am I going to learn? There's many ways to learn, but one way that we learn, unfortunately, is we suffer. So incarnating on earth as it transitions from Kali to Dwapara, where things are insecure, and at the present time getting more so, is just a really great place to learn to trust God and to have the courage to stand for high principles when the society as a whole is not standing for those high principles. Like, how else would we learn those lessons? So now we get to. So it's not a curse at all. It was a very good idea to be born now. And God doesn't care, really. I mean, we're just born over and over again. This is in the Bhagavad Gita. Arjuna says to Krishna, I can't go to war. I can't kill these people. These are my cousins and my relatives. And Krishna says, well, you think they die. They don't die. I mean, just like, that was his answer. And he said, you see their bodies fall. I see their spirits rise. So really, have they died or have they risen? Which have they done? Well, their bodies have fallen away, but they have just gone on to the astral world and on to their next life. So God has a very different perspective on death. He's not trying to kill us off, but when the time comes, as it absolutely inevitably will to everyone, the body falls, the spirit rises. Master went so far as to say, when a soul is born on earth, there's a birthday celebration on the material plane, and there's a funeral in the astral world, because that person is gone from that world and is now in this one. In this world, when someone dies in this world, there's a funeral on the material plane, and there's a welcome home birthday party on the astral plane. So which is more true? I mean, from the material plane, most of us can only see this dimension. But if we could see both dimensions, what would we say? Ramakrishna was a great avatar, lived in the late 1800s in Calcutta, India. When his nephew, who'd been his companion and caregiver and friend for many years, his nephew died, Hridai. He died. And Ramakrishna, who was this marvelous mix of the human and the divine in one reality, on one hand, he was dancing in ecstasy and talking about how when Hridai died, he saw his soul ascending in light. And then, Ramakrishna was just ecstatic because Hridai had died. And then the next moment, he was sobbing because Hridai had died. And who will walk with me by the Ganges? Who will bring me my tea in the morning? Who will talk to me in the evening? And he talked about all the ways that he'd lost Hridai. And then he would think again of the bliss of Hridai's soul, and he would then go into that ecstatic state. Both are true. This is the nature of this world. And the solution to what we're dealing with is elevating our consciousness and all this sectarianism and hatred and racism and, above all, greed and materialism. It's a war. It really is. It's the war of Kurukshetra. It's manifesting a little bit in society, but the real war is inside. Where do I put my consciousness? And when darkness intrudes, because it's happening too close around me, do I fear it? Or am I able to trust in God, even in those hard moments? I mean, none of us, until we're free, are free. And that's what we get to work with. I'm saying all of this because it's very important. And Master told us it's going to get harder. So we need to be ready. Swami gave a series of talks once called Building Spiritual Power Against Troubled Times. And it's worth thinking about. So now, September 19th, 2001, we're still in this same section, on responding to the terrorist attacks. He says, the issue wasn't easy for me to address. For of course we should look for the cause, but how much are people actually able to introspect? Meaning, we should think about what we've done wrong that's brought this on us. I got a letter from someone saying we should love, love, love the terrorists. Beautiful. But do you suppose anyone really does that, including the person who wrote me that letter? I don't think so. The important thing is to be real, not hypocritical. You see, the war that's going on between light and darkness is not a war of words. It's a war of vibration. This is not a debate. This is not a debate in which I can be so clever as to argue my side and persuade you of my side and get 5 impartial judges to say my argument was better than yours. This is a war of vibration and of consciousness. So if you just say love, love, love the terrorist, but really if you were standing right in front of such a person who was going after someone you love to kill them, what kind of an impulse would actually arise in your heart? That's who we are. I mean, it's easy to sit in a sanctuary desk somewhere and write beautiful poetic words. It's quite different to actually have that power. Now, Mahatma Gandhi, when the man came up and shot him, his words, he said Ram, 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 and he pronounced to the man who killed him. And that was not pretense, that was just who he was. God in the form of Ram has now come to me as an assassin. And Gandhi, but look at the life he lived to be able to actually do that. Jesus Christ on the crucifix, on the cross, looked at those who had crucified him and said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Instead of feeling any anger or antagonism or fear against these people, he actually prayed. He actually interceded. Father, forgive them means, this is not good karma for these folks, but I'm going to divinely intercede for them. That's what his prayer meant. Father, forgive them. Let them be spared. They don't know. They don't realize what they've done here. I mean, that's extraordinary kind of love. Swami talks happily about a dream he had in which, people who, his self-declared enemies, as he called them, self-defined enemies, were burning him at the stake. And he felt perfectly relaxed. He didn't feel angry with them or anything. Well, they just want to burn me at the stake, so they will. And he told us all about that dream. He was rescued by his friends, but he said he was equally even-minded when he was rescued. There was no change in his consciousness between being burned at the stake by his self-declared enemies and being rescued from that fate by his friends. And he afterward commented how nice that was, even in his subconscious state, that it was just all the same to him. Because it was all, he could feel the presence and the will of God behind it all. And those aren't words. Those are really how you feel. Here's just an interesting point just about that. The army apparently tried in every possible way to develop some kind of a questionnaire or something, interview process, that could determine in advance who would be a hero on the battlefield. And they absolutely failed. There was just simply no way to predict it. Because it wasn't a matter of what you could say or what you could imagine. It was who you actually are. And we don't know who we are sometimes until we're tested, which is one of the reasons we incarnate in a time like this, because we get to find out who we are. We get to really find out. Not what we think and what we can articulate and what we can pontificate about, but who am I actually? So when Swami gets this letter that we should love, love, love the terrorists, Swami said, who can really do that? Including the person who suggested I do it. And he says, the important thing is to be real, not hypocritical. The truth is that if anyone gave that much energy to the evildoers, he would not only be depriving the sufferers, but also tuning into the evil. You understand? If you're thinking that much about the evildoers and trying so hard to shift their consciousness, you're also tuning into them. No wholesome exercise for anyone who is seeking truth and God. I get impatient with such lack of genuine sincerity. I talked about this last week, I believe, where I've had to advise friends, and appropriately, because this is how Swami advised us. If somebody is really dark in your life, don't pray for them. Tell Divine Mother that you wish them well, but don't put your mind on them, because it will link your mind to theirs. And if their energy is stronger for shadow than yours is to convert them to the light, you will be the loser because you will be tuning into that evil. So Swami knows that the person who wrote this letter to him doesn't have the power to really transform those people, and should not be putting his mind there, because it will just he'll be pulled down by that shadow. I believe last week I also mentioned my friend who had serious cancer and was concerned about going through the rather draconian allopathic medicine way of dealing with it. So she said to Swami that she was going to heal herself through natural means. And Swami just looked at her and looked her in the eye very calmly, with no judgment. But he just said, "Do you have the concentration and willpower to do that?" And with his truth-telling energy in front of her, and she's just looking right back at him, she said, "No, sir, I don't." So it sounds good, and it's even theoretically possible, but do you have the willpower and energy to really do that? And if you don't, then you have to be practical in your idealism. You have to be real, not hypocritical. Oh, you should just love them. But that's hypocritical, because you can't do it. You're telling everybody else to do it, but are you actually doing it? Whoever the you is, am I actually doing it? I can't suggest it because I can't do it. So, I get impatient with such lack of genuine sincerity. By sincerity, he means that you're proposing something that you yourself can't do. And it's not sincere. This is what we all should do. But it's not sincere because I don't have access to that power. So Swami says, that was a good article from the Dalai Lama. I remember that the Dalai Lama wrote something very good at that point, but I don't remember what it was. He told the truth. Oh, yeah, of course, the Dalai Lama wrote about everything that happened to China and Tibet and the choices he personally had to make. And I remember how powerful that was, because that was a very sincere letter, because he'd been there and he had to make choices, and his choice was to abandon his country, because he learned that they didn't have the power to stand up. I've been in a number of difficult situations, now that I think about it, where I might have felt that my point of view was righteous and ought to be carried out, but I also was practical in my idealism and realized, and the words are very simple, I didn't have any power. I either didn't have responsibility, or I didn't have influence, or I didn't have the respect, or I didn't have, the support of others. And so it's pointless. I didn't have any power, so I just had to let things go until such time as I had something that was really mine to stand on, that wasn't just platitudes. There's a huge difference. Anyway, that was a good article from the Dalai Lama. He told the truth. I'd have liked, however, for him to be more specific. I noted he fell into the trap of rhetoric and repetition that I had to try repeatedly to avoid when Swami was writing about the terrorist attack. And even so, I find on rereading my article that I've repeated myself unnecessarily. Still, his statement is the clearest, wisest, and most genuine of those I've seen on the event so far. Of course, we don't have it in front of us. It would be easy to find. I do remember how powerful it was, and it was powerful because it was based on experience. A bully drove him out of his own country, made him an exile. Our K through 8 school, over the course of many years, has done a big theater production every year based on some inspiring figure. And one year we did our play on the Dalai Lama. This was a number of years ago. And we made friends with some of the Tibetan monks in the area. That there was a small Tibetan monastery just in San Jose, down south from here. That monastery eventually moved up to north of San Francisco, but they were down there at that time. And the monks literally, they gave us the shirts off their backs. I was the costumer, and they gave me a stack of the actual shirts that the monks wear, and then he told me where to buy the other fabric, so I was actually able to dress our kids in the real, so they really looked like Tibetan monks. It was very sweet. And even more than that, the head monk there gave us these priceless tankas, I think they're called, you know, these huge paintings of Buddhist paintings that are the same ones that they would hang on the walls when the Dalai Lama came to visit. And he just gave them to us, and we hung them on our stage. And we got involved with the whole Tibetan community. There was a Tibetan dance troupe in Berkeley, and I got to know all of them, and they just let us rent from them these wonderful costumes, authentic Tibetan costumes, and then the Tibetan community turned out to see our play. It was all so totally uplifting and fun, and as a consequence, as I said, my role has been to do the costumes, but we all get involved. When I say do, I don't necessarily mean make. I just mean assemble and organize. And let me see. Oh, yes, there was a documentary film that we watched. And the documentary film was the flight of the Dalai Lama. This wasn't a Hollywood version. This was actual footage of the Dalai Lama, who was sick, had pneumonia or something like that at the time. He was 17, maybe not even that old. He was put on a horse in Tibet, and he escaped from the country. Then he crossed the border into India so that he wouldn't be killed. His life had always been just absolutely structured, and he was so protected, and even his own family couldn't approach him. I mean, this very unusual upbringing there in this big palace. He crosses the border into India. He's pulled off the horse. People are all up against him and touching him and crowding around. And just like in 1 minute, everything in his life was different. And from that point, it was. And horrific things happened to the people who were left behind. So when such a person talks about how do you respond in the face of profound, violent, evil actions, you know, he's earned the right to speak. And that's why Swami said it was the best that he had heard, because there it really is. So, I mean, that's what you're really up against. Don't be fatuous about these things, because we have a lot we're going to face coming up. And we're going to have a lot of tough decisions to make. We need to be very calm, very centered, and very thoughtful, and not dogmatic and not fearful. I mean, I'm not a courageous person in countless ways. And, you know, so when I say that, yeah, I know, we all get afraid. But we have to work together to keep ourselves from acting from fear. Courage is the capacity to do the right thing even if you're afraid. So we just have to help each other, see what comes. We're practicing with the pandemic, but I think it's going to be harder than this. God willing, it won't be, but we'll see. We're a year later. Response to questions from a talk show host. Now this is September 13th, 2002. So now we're a year later, and probably somebody is trying to do a program in relation. Swami writes, I'm not willing to appear on someone's program. My reason is not that I haven't what may be useful thoughts on the subject raised, but I am not willing to fight over them, which is what a talk show host would be likely to be. My reasons are twofold. So he must have looked into whoever it was, and he decided he didn't want to be there. Swami is very powerful in his point of view, but he doesn't argue. He never argued. If somebody wanted what he had, he explained it to them. If they had sincere questions, he would answer them. And he could answer them extremely well. Clarify, expound, satisfy a sincere doubt. but he wouldn't argue, and a lot of times, and this is just what I'm saying, entertainment is, let's polarize things, let's fight with each other, it's not really a genuine search for truth. It's just, let's get both points of view up here and let's hear what everybody has to say, instead of saying, let's try to understand what's lastingly real. This is part of what I was saying earlier. So my reasons are twofold, Swami writes. I'm hard of hearing and might very well miss key statements in the caller's questions or comments. And that is really the truth. Swami was very hard of hearing, had as the best hearing aids he could have, but whenever he was in a group, he would always have somebody who had a clear voice that Swami could easily hear sit next to him, because very often Swami just couldn't understand. And then that person would articulate clearly to Swami, and then he was perfectly capable of answering, but he knew he couldn't always hear. And in a rough and tumble conversation, people say things, and Swami didn't trust that he could follow it. Swami said, I have not made these issues a life commitment. And these are questions as the questions come out, responding to aggressive actions on the part of other countries. This is not my area of expertise, Swami says. Sort of funny, because Swami was himself a king in quite a few incarnations. And it was a very small thing, but I had such an amusing, somehow it made such an impression on me. Swami would sometimes comment about the actions of world leaders, or he would comment about world political events, but when he would comment as if he were one of them. I would speak about the president or the premier or the dictator, and it was just clear that I was just from the peanut gallery making a comment. But when Swami would talk about these global leaders, he would always be talking as if he was sitting at the table and commenting about what they should do. And the remark he made once, it was such an obvious remark, but there was so much in it, it made an impression. He was talking about Israel, and he was talking about Israel having captured the Golan Heights, and that there was international pressure for them to return that land to whoever had it before, which I think was Syria. And Swami just said very simply, they should never return the Golan Heights now that they have it. It would be folly to give it back. And it was, just a political statement. But I could see it was from one who'd had to defend his country many times before. And now that they had that strategic advantage, which when I went to Israel, I really saw what that was, because for years, the opposition could be at the top of that, and they were just like, the Israelis were shooting ducks. And when they got that height, it just made all the difference to their security. And Swami was just, they should never give it back, no matter what international pressure they face. But it was that feeling. Still, Swami said, this is not my life commitment. My life commitment is teaching people the teachings of self-realization. I am not a king. I am not a politician. So, and then he says, 3, I believe deeply in certain principles and would feel duty-bound to defend them in certain contexts. These, however, are facts, not principles. I think there should be room for different points of view concerning them, meaning the issues that you want me to talk about are factual issues, they're not principles. So Swami says, I'll talk about principles, but these are facts, and people have different points of view. Who's in danger, who's not, who did what to whom, all that sort of thing. And he didn't want to engage on that level. That much said, here are my thoughts on the questions from that radio interviewer. So Swami's willing to write his answers, but not to speak them over the air. First question had to do with responding to our aggressors. So this is the year anniversary of the terrorist attack. I think we should respond usefully, Swami says. Be practical in your idealism. I don't think it would be useful to send love to people who hate us in this way. They are God's children, but they are not my children. Isn't that sweet? My job is to love God. Being human, however, my ability to love is not cosmic. I consider it more important to love God and in that way to do my little part in opening a channel for his love to this world. See, they're not my children. This is Swami writes this elsewhere. I'm not responsible for them. And I can't take responsibility for them because I'm not big enough to take responsibility for them. And that's, that I'm understanding it more clearly even than I've been able to say it before. It's like, this is, I can't save these souls. They've done a very wrong thing. Swami can't say like Jesus did, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, and have that actually have the power to actually change their karma. Jesus had the power to change their karma. Swami says, I don't have that power. And furthermore, it's not my job. They're God's children. He's responsible for them. This is where Swami said earlier in a previous letter, and honestly, I understand it better from how he put it here. God has to work it out for them because they're his children, but they're not mine. And my job is to love God, because if I love God within myself, then I will be able to radiate that love to others. But for me to focus on trying to work with these people, I can't work with these people. I don't have any opening. They're not interested in me. There has to be some receptivity. They have to want to be in tune with what Swami has. You can't force it on them. And they're not. They're interested in something else. They're doing something else right now. We should send out love generally to the world in his name, but our own love should be directed to those who can be united in working for world harmony and peace. Okay, we love generally, but we also need to be very specific. We need to make alliances with people with whom we can work and build energy. Swami says, Osama bin Laden is more than I can take on with my limited powers. It's like, I can't work with him. He's just too strong and too fixed. And, we really think about that. You see how he's saying it? The thing about Swamiji was he had this power. We would come to him, over many years, and a lot of us we had lots of ideas that we just kind of accumulated. I don't know where we'd accumulated them from our upbringing, from books we'd read, from friends who'd influenced us, from college professors, from completely just, oh, that seems like a good idea kind of thing. And we'd kind of present them to Swamiji a lot of times, and sometimes they would be sort of like it's just like when this question comes up, this is what I say. And Swami always was able to just sort through what was just muddy thinking and just bring us down, like it sounds good. Oh, well, we should, Osama bin Laden is God's child. We should love him. But he's more than I can take on. My love's not going to touch him because he's not interested in it. We should work with those who we can make power together. So, very important. And it's not my responsibility. It's just like nobody's asked me to reform these people because it's a foolish thing to ask of me. I can't do it. So Osama bin Laden is more than I can take on with my limited powers. I don't wish him ill. I simply feel that the best I can do is wish all well who want to work for God's light and love. It's just, there it is. Had I been on the plane from Pennsylvania that was flying to Washington, I would have joined the attackers of the terrorists. It would have meant my death. I wouldn't have hated the terrorists, but I feel we must stand by truth. Life and death are not important before such issues. We must all die someday. I'd rather die for truth than try to live for untruths. So I guess the question was also, what would you have done if you were on that plane? Well, I would have sacrificed my life for the sake of others. Of course, that's what I would have done. Because we live and die many times, and all we ever have is our consciousness. So if we violate the principles of truth, we hurt ourselves far more than merely if our body dies. Because the only continuing reality is our consciousness. And you don't know. You could have been born entirely to have the courage in that moment to give your life. I mean, to be a soldier. The Kshatriya caste is characterized by the soldier. The Kshatriya is a soldier because a soldier values his country or his principles more than he values even his own life. And so it epitomizes that. Self-disciplined, self-controlled, self-sacrificing for a higher ideal. Now, of course, you don't have to be a physical soldier with a gun in your hand, but you have to be willing to stand strong in the face of untruth and be willing to die for truth. And that's a victory. That's victorious. These people died on that plane, but it was a glorious death because they valued others more than they valued themselves. And that's the direction of enlightenment. And because their bodies die, but their spirits rise, as Krishna says, nothing really happens. So, and it was the only choice at that point for those on the plane. I mean, I often think about that, as many people do. Wow, what a moment. That you would know that, in half an hour, I won't be breathing in this body anymore. Quite a time. Sometimes people do know that. And you get this wholly different. I had a very interesting experience once in that respect. There was the husband of a woman who was part of our church, and I knew him socially. He never embraced the teachings of Ananda, but he was very supportive. He was very supportive of her. He was a self-made man. He was very successful, very successful. He loved his money. He spent it a lot on himself, not in awful ways, but in just enjoyment. Pleasure was his watchword. But he worked hard, and he was maybe in 50 or something like that, and he was an athlete. He used to run 5 miles every day, and he developed a backache when he was out running, and it was persistent. He went to the hospital and discovered that his body was riddled with cancer. It was in his bones, up his spine. There was no hope for him. Then something happened, and he lost consciousness. Well, actually, and there was about 2 weeks there, and I talked to him and talked to his wife, and his basic attitude, he loved his life. He was perfectly happy, but he used the phrase, "It's been a good run. I have no complaints. Everything I wanted to have happened, and I mean, he let go of his life in one of the most beautifully detached ways that I've ever seen. So it's not a question of what we look like on the outside, it's who we are. He didn't conform to any of our teachings, apparently, but nonetheless, he was deeply grateful for every good thing that happened and completely courageous in saying goodbye to it. So there was no hope for him, and he wasn't going to even pretend. And something happened, and he had a crisis, and they put him on a life support machine, and he had been unconscious. And his wife made the tough decision to take him off of life support. So then she called me and asked me to be there. So at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday, they were going to take him off of life support, and they didn't expect him to live more than 5 or 10 minutes after that. So when I got there, he was fully conscious. He had been unconscious. He was totally wide awake. And he couldn't talk because he had this machine down his throat, but his eyes were wide open and he was completely there. And he was calm and fearless. And he knew, we're all there, we're watching the clock. We know at 3 o'clock he's going to die. Unbelievable, except there it was. And he wasn't afraid, and I could have been projecting, but I think he wasn't. He just wasn't afraid. And I wasn't afraid. And pretty much everyone else in the room was afraid. And it was when I realized, wow, the one thing that a self-realizationist can bring to a deathbed is the lack of fear. And the hospital protocol is that before they take someone off of a life support machine, they'll give him some heavy narcotics. He's going to die anyway, so they'll give him, heavy narcotics. I tried to talk to the doctors and the nurses and said, he's fine. He's not at all afraid. You don't have to do that. But I realized, well, one, it was protocol, but I also realized that they needed to do it. It must be hard being in that position a lot if you don't understand that we are part of a greater reality. So they sedated him. So when they took the life support off, he was already unconscious. And he lived just, a couple of more minutes because he was gone. But wow, it reminded me, which I have always known, but it reminded me, don't be superficial in your judgments of people. You never know who people really are. In a moment like that, he proved himself to be a great yogi. And maybe that's where all his power as a businessman and so on came from. I really couldn't say. It's just quite something to remember. Oh, when I was in another country, I met a man who was a heart surgeon. And he was a very high-level surgeon, and he often worked on the last chance cases. Maybe something he could do would work. So a lot of his patients died because they just did, because that's where they were. He was making an effort, but it couldn't be done. And he had become deeply involved in our teachings. And he said to me, it was so touching to me, he said, naturally, as a heart surgeon, you would think my job was to help people to live. He said, but I've really come to understand that as important, perhaps more important, is that I'm there to help people die. And he was just talking about how becoming Master's disciple and learning all the teachings of self-realization and everything were just, he was so thrilled because he'd been caught in this situation. He was not, he was a pretty experienced surgeon, and he'd begun to understand. He was not without faith or understanding, but Master's teachings just opened it, and he was so grateful because now he could be so much better at being a doctor. But he'd learned that, keeping people alive isn't the only job he had. I loved it. It was such a touching moment to just realize we're part of a greater reality. See, that's the war that's going on. So let's go now, and then there's a question here about nonviolence. Again, Swami says, I think we must be practical. A nonviolent movement would not be practiced at this time and is not the way to bring about a cessation of violence on earth. There were a group of politicians who wanted to advocate pacifism, I guess how you say it, and they commissioned a study, and they discovered that every country that had laid down arms and tried to make the whole nation of pacifists was taken over by some warring, aggressive country, that there was no example in our history on this planet of it ever succeeding. So that's what Swami says, a nonviolent movement could not be practiced at this time, would not be practical at this time, and is not the way to bring about a cessation of violence on earth. Were I a Jesus Christ, I might have the power to win evil with love, though he was crucified, wasn't he? So he may have had that power, but nonetheless he was still crucified, wasn't he? No, I don't think violence is the answer. But if I am attacked, I think it is my duty to win in some way for the truth. If I can win with love, all the better. If I haven't that power, then I must fight. Not with hatred, but with love for truth, and not for those who are in error. It's very interesting when you read Swami's autobiography, The Path, and actually just in general when you talk to him, he recites in a number of places in the book about he had to fight, or other people would fight him and he had to fight back. Physically, he had to fight back. Or when he could fight back, he did, or he had to endure physical attacks when he was simply overpowered and there was no other response. But he didn't run away or back down from a fight. He just faced right into it. And even when he knew that the aggressor was stronger than he and would be able to overpower him physically, Swami still stood up to them. And so did Master. When you read Mejda, the book about Master's childhood, there are multiple examples in which Master stood his ground and fought. Those are very important examples, because you would think, that these souls, of all souls, would be above violence, but they were practical in their idealism. And, it's especially interesting to me about how, because sometimes nowadays people don't want little boys, to learn how to be tough physically. And so I find it interesting that Swami tells stories about boyhood fights, and Master's life also has stories about boyhood fights. It's just, we have to think clearly. We can't just be fatuous because it sounds better. There was a story told about a young boy who lived at Mount Washington. Mount Washington was the ashram where Master lived from 1920 until his passing in 1952. He had a couple of other places, but that was the main headquarters. And in the early years, it wasn't the strict monastery that it became. There were people who brought their children there, and there were children who also lived there. And there was this one boy, I think he was about 6 or 7 years old, maybe a little older, and he was sort of pacing around in the hallway of the dining room where Master was eating, and he might have had some weapon with him, some toy weapon, and he was behaving in a very warlike manner, and some of the women were quite, upset that they were thinking this warlike manner on the part of this little boy wasn't really appropriate. But Master saw the boy, and he called the boy to him, and he sort of asked him what he was doing, but in a way of, he wanted a report, he wasn't calling him on the carpet. And the boy said that he was there to protect Yogananda from the bad guys. And Master said, well, if you're going to do that, you need to be closer to me. So would you be kind enough to just stand behind my chair in case someone comes at me? And so the little boy got to just stand behind the chair and protect Yogananda. And far from thinking that was something that shouldn't happen, Master knew that it was something that should happen, that the boy needed to feel the courage. And that's how he, in his child mind, that's how he saw it. And of course, there were no bad guys invading it. But Master knew that it was very important for this young person to develop in himself the courage to defend what he loved. Instead of being told, no, you shouldn't be doing that. Of course you should be doing that. Because there may be times where we have to give up our lives and stand up and fight. It's not a world that is very familiar to me, but I often wonder. This was not physical at all, but at one point when I was involved with these really terrible attorneys, this was during the SRF, the litigation that Swami referred to. And I can't remember exactly what prompted it. But I had something to say to one of those attorneys, and I was so mad at him. And I didn't really think this through, but I followed that man all the way to the elevator and gave him a piece of my mind. And after he got into the elevator and left, I don't clearly remember what the circumstances were, But I remember actually afterwards thinking, good for me. I wasn't going to take it. And I stood up for it. And I'm not normally one who seeks out a fight. But it just was the right thing to do, and so I did it. And I don't know what I would do if the fight was physical. But even in that circumstance, and the thing about it that really impressed me about me was that when he started to move away from me, I followed him. Without thought, I just followed him. I wasn't done. And I would have expected myself to be relieved that he was moving away from me. It's very tiny, very, very tiny. But we need to watch for those things, And as Swami said, in certain situations, I will fight for my principles. And we need to raise our children to have courage as well. So, my friends, God bless you.